I'm Helen, and I'm very happy to be here today. I don't have slides, so you don't have to look there. You can just look at me. I'm here today with two hats. So on the one hand, I'm the co-founder of the Berlin-based Chaos Pilots. That's basically a platform for new ways of learning. So we run programs for students, as well as for organizations, actually, around topics like leadership, activism, complexity. And then, on the other hand, I am a global venture lead at IKEA, where I'm trying to get IKEA to be able to do disruptive innovation. So I'm kind of with one foot in education and entrepreneurship, and then with one foot in corporate venture building, which are two, you can probably imagine, two very different worlds. But they have some things in common, some themes in common. And creativity is one of those themes. And that's why I'm here talking about creativity today. So at Chaos Pilot, we run creative leadership programs, teaching people actually how can they, using creativity, lead in a creative way and lead teams to build things. And at IKEA, we very much rely on our creativity in order to build ventures that potentially can disrupt whole markets. So what I want to talk about today, and I'll try to keep this in 10 minutes, there's no time, I know, so, is three things. One, what is creativity and what is creative confidence? Two, how do we create environments that actually foster creativity? And then three, what are some of the ways that, or some things that we can do to actually get creative? Because we do still get stuck. So let's start with creativity. And over the past 10-ish years, I've run hundreds of design workshops with students, with organizations. And one thing that comes up a lot is this idea that you're either creative or you're analytical. So you're a scientist, you're probably more analytical. You're an artist, you're probably more creative. And this kind of struck me, and I wanted to understand that better, because for me, from where I was standing, it was always like, anyone can be creative. But there seemed to be people who were very fixed on this idea that they were not creative. So what I actually found out was that anyone is creative. As humans, we are born creative. But what happens is that over time, we make experiences that kind of limit our creativity. Things that you do a sketch in school and your teacher says, "Ooh, that doesn't look like an elephant," or you build a sculpture and your parents don't see what you were going for. And even in university, you come up with an idea and a professor says, that's never going to be a viable business. And so what we do is we start to opt out of thinking of ourselves as creative. And it's easy if there is an alternative, if you can kind of say, well, I'm just not a creative type, I'm more the analytical type. And what's fascinating about that is that creativity obviously comes from a place of vulnerability. So you create something that doesn't exist yet. And if it doesn't exist yet, it's probably not going to be perfect the first time you try. So you are vulnerable, right? You are kind of showing something that is unfinished, and that is not easy. But when people start trusting in their creativity, that's when they actually start following their passions more. That's when they start becoming developing more grit. That's when they start actually following through with things, and that's when they eventually also become more successful at what they do. So that brings me to my second point, which is how can we create more creative environments, and how can we help people to develop this creative confidence? And what I've learned through approaches like design thinking, but also creative leadership, is that you can't make people change their minds. You can't make people think they're creative just by telling them what I just told you. You are actually creative. People will still not trust in themselves. It's a little bit like fear, right? If you're afraid of snakes, I can't just come up to you and say, well, this snake is not poisonous, so don't be afraid of it. You'll still be afraid of snakes. So what we actually need to do is create almost a step-by-step process and slowly build this confidence. And then maybe you start by looking at a picture of a snake. And then you start by looking through a window at a snake. And then you look at a snake in a room with the door open. And then you are in the room with a snake. And then you slowly get comfortable every step that you take until you can actually touch the snake and nothing bad happens. And it's very similar with creativity. We need to make small experiences where we get to be creative and where nothing bad happens. And then slowly, and I've done that, slowly you can build creative confidence. I have a script here and I completely lost where I was at because I was just talking. So these small exercises basically help you to gain creative confidence and to be okay with being vulnerable in that process. And once you're there and you have people feel more confident about being creative, then you can actually start by creating an environment that actually fosters that and supports that. And there are a couple of things that you can do, I think, especially working in work environments and in teams that will help kind of develop this further. One is that you match people with the right jobs. And it sounds very simple, but you actually have to make sure that people don't just do a job because that's the job that comes up and that's the person who has capacity, but you have to match people with the jobs that stretch their abilities but play to their strengths. That will create intrinsic motivation, which is a key factor for creativity. And then it's about giving freedom, giving enough freedom for how to go about a task. So instead of, it's okay, you can give them a goal in what to achieve, but give autonomy in how you go about it. Because that will create sense of ownership, which again creates creativity. Adequate amount of resources, so time and money, that's something that we often have too tight deadlines, not enough budget to do something big killer of creativity. And then obviously, but you need to create diverse teams with different perspectives that also allow and support each other in their creativities. And then finally, you want to acknowledge and encourage people to be creative. I think there's nothing that kills creativity more than having the feeling that the work that I do doesn't actually matter. So, okay, so we're trying to get people to be confident about their own creativity. We're creating environments that kind of foster creativity. Then, unfortunately, that's still not a guarantee that you won't get stuck, right? And you still get stuck. So one thing that I've asked a lot of people, just because I'm curious really, is when are they most creative? Think about it, when are you most creative? And one of the things that comes up a lot is under the shower. So that's a popular one, but it's also going for a walk. There's a Stanford study that looked at people's creativity, and people who walk are more creative. You don't even have to walk outside. You can walk on a treadmill and you're being more creative, which is kind of funny. But people are more creative when they're running or when they're commuting. The answer is never working. Why? Because at work, we're under pressure. We have to deliver certain goals. We have deadlines. We have meetings. And people often actually say, I don't actually have time to think when I'm working, which is contradictory, because that's where we're expected to be creative, right? So what's really interesting is that then once we stop working, we go on the train, that's when we start having ideas. And neuroscientists actually found that when our brains are relaxed or even bored, that's when they light up the most. So that's when brain activity actually happens in the brain, which is so fascinating. And this is called the default mode network, which is basically imagine a network that kind of connects different parts of your brain that normally don't communicate. And so you're literally creating new connections in your brain, which is kind of the basis for new ideas, right? So one thing that we can do at work is to more consciously build in breaks or activities that don't necessarily have to do with the actual work that we're doing. Oh, speaking of breaks, I'm almost done. Let me just kind of get my last point, okay?
Yes, please, do.
Okay, good.
Of course.
So taking conscious breaks, doing conscious activities, like literally doing little energizers, something that I used to do a lot as my role in the D school, where you really get people to play, you get people to move, and you get people to kind of take a break from that pressure thinking so that you can actually make these new connections in your brain. So I guess, and I'm coming to my last point, the point I'm making is in these times where we have these big challenges that we're trying to solve that really need big solutions and creative solutions, let's try to gain some creative confidence. Let's try to create environments where people can be creative. Let's try to get bored more often. Let's try to laugh and enjoy so that we can actually come up with good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you. Oh, crikey. I was just thinking about that's not an elephant in the room. And I just can't, I can't stop myself. It's a bit like building flat pack furniture sometimes, isn't it? That's not a bed. Sorry, yeah. Blame them. They asked me to do this. Okay, right. So, questions. I have questions, but it's over to you, people. There's a hand at the back. Anna or Paul, who's the closest?
Thank you. It's a nice point about creativity. I was going to ask you if you have any formula. I have a formula for making people creative who think they're boring. So I'll ask you first how do you encourage people not to be boring?
How do I encourage people not to be boring or bored?
Yeah. It's another way of being, most people are boring.
You think so?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate? Why are people boring?
So what I mean is, if you get people to walk to new places, get new objects, speak to new people, there's 3 ways you're not boring. People, place, object. You just turn around, because people go to the same places, they have the same objects, they talk to the same people. So you offend them, say, oh, I'm not boring. It's like, you are.
Yes.
I'm not saying you, but in general. Do you have any tips, on that?
Tips on not to be boring?
Yeah.
I think use your phone less. I think that's probably my big tip of not to be boring, which also connects to what I was talking about, of like your brain needs to get bored a little bit in order to come up with new ideas. And I think that's something that we kind of we're constantly looking at our phones. We're walking somewhere, being boring and looking at our phones and kind of constantly engaging with the next thing and swapping between tasks. And I think one thing that it's hard for me as well, but to kind of break that habit is to not do that anymore and consciously decide not to do that. And then let's see what we do with that time.
So breaking habits. Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. Thanks.
I was going to say it's conscious boredom, isn't it? It's rather than just being, because often you're not conscious of being either boring or bored. Well, I mean, yeah, but you sort of consciously have to stop certain processes in your mind, don't you, in order to allow other things to come in.
Exactly.
That's just big. You were nodding quite a lot during Helen's talk. Could you perhaps share with us what you were nodding about? In agreement, you were nodding.
I resonated quite a bit with...
Thank you, Anna.
I resonated quite a bit with what you said because, often it's easy to get distracted with... I often... It's almost an unfortunate confession, but I end up doing some of my best work on the weekends, right? And that's only because there's no pressure of the deadline. There's no pressure of anything else. It's just that, you almost have the privilege of thinking about the problem in a new way and not having to answer to anybody at all, which I thought was really fascinating. So that point really resonated with me. I don't really have any questions, but I agree quite strongly with what you said.
That's nice. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Come on. Think creative. We have some people. Amir.
Thank you.
Just wait for Anna with the microphones, and everybody can hear you.
This is not a difficult question, but do you study how to measure creativity?
Do I personally study that?
Or
no.
with your work? Have you seen a report or research or any form of evaluation of how much creative people can get or how to measure creativity? Yeah. What's the benchmark?
Yeah. So I mentioned I used to co-lead the program at the D School, and with that program, there's a partner program at the D School in Stanford, and they actually do quite a lot of that. So, for example, the walking study that I mentioned, they actually measure creativity, and they also look at what actually makes a creative idea. So, what counts as creativity, what doesn't count as creativity, and what they do is basically say, well, it has to be practical and it has to be novel. So that's kind of their baseline, and then they create different environments and actually measure levels of creativity. Yes.
Please, Sebastian.
If I may try to give an answer to your question, I was completely stunned by the head of the Leo Burnett advertising agency, a German guy hardly speaking English. 20 years ago, he applied a school grade system for creativity in the agency. And it moved Leo Burnett from number 19 of all global agencies to number 1. It was very impressive. It impressed me so much that I implemented it in my own agency, and it worked the very same way. And the key thing was that the grades had a name, so it was a definition that you could understand, and there was a self-grading and a central grading. And the differentiation between the central grading and the decentralized grading was half a grade out of 1 to 10. So there was all of a sudden, there was a way to do that. And I guess the beauty of your question is another very famous line: you treasure what you measure. The money people know how to measure. The creative people don't. And this is why they are always in kind of defensive mood. Like we improved our Polish office, our Singapore office from a 7 to an 8 or from a 4 to a 5. All of a sudden you have a measurable output in creativity, not only in terms of euro, dollars, whatever, but in the creative product.
Oh, you stopped. I was just making a note there. We have one more. We got time for one question. Over here. Thank you.
So first, creativity and measuring. So in German, we have an old rule from measuring technology, from maturity. They are missed. So,
does anybody need translation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's.
I mistranslated missed. Okay.
So, the problem
It's
with
hard to translate.
the measuring of creativity, you can measure what makes people more creative. But this creativity by themselves is not to measure. If you try to measure, you had put numbers on it. And when you put numbers on it, the people want to do what they have to have good numbers. From then, you break the creativity step by step. But on the other point, we know that people are working and sitting on a place had less oxygen in their brain. When you stand up and walking, you have more oxygen in your brain, and it's working more fine. That is what you can measure. And that's a different.
Thank you very much. We're up against the clock. Helen van Baal, thank you very much from IKEA. That was very creative. Thank you very much. Now, we've got